15-bullet outline, the boring routine of a 15th century monk. Cold wake-up bell. Your eyes snap open in the pitch-black cold as the monastery bell tolls before dawn. Barefoot to chapel. You shuffle barefoot over icy stone to join the brothers in a groggy chorus of matins. Chant until sunrise. You chant Latin psalms until your stomach aches louder than the organ. Breakfast of silence. You eat gray porridge under strict silence while a novice reads aloud in Latin. Manual labor begins. Assigned to garden duty. You spend hours weeding under drizzling skies, copying by candlelight. The scriptorium waits back-breaking hours copying manuscripts with cramped fingers. Midday meal ritual. You eat again this time, in slightly more warmth. Still no talking, still more porridge. Confession and correction. You kneel for confession even if you're only guilty of daydreaming during prayers. The monk who snores. In shared cells, you struggle to nap through Brother Gilbert's legendary snoring. Afternoon sermon duty. You take your turn reading aloud from dusty sermons to barely awake brothers. Secret garden, shortcut. A rare moment of mischief sneaking a shortcut through the herb garden for a breather. Evening animal chores. You feed chickens and milk goats in the dim light, dodging a particularly vengeful goose. Final prayers by firelight. Vespers draw you back to chapel candlelit faces flickering with fatigue. Monk gossip and toe fungus. Bedtime brings whispered monk gossip and the eternal horror of shared foot baths. Night watch and final thoughts. As you pace your hour of night watch, you wonder if tomorrow will finally be different. It won't. Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world wrapped in wool and ruled by bells. The dim, drafty routine of a 15th century monk. The walls are thick stone, the floors colder than a tax collector's smile, and your blanket, stuffed with straw that somehow manages to itch and stab you at the same time. You wake not because you want to, but because the monastery's great iron bell clangs like a frying pan dropped from heaven. It's pitch black outside, so black you can't tell if your eyes are open. The air bites your skin the moment you shed the coarse wool blanket. No fire was lit last night. It's forbidden until morning light, so you pull on your habit still damp from yesterday's rain and shiver your way upright. Your cell is the size of a broom closet. Technically, it is the broom closet just without the broom. It holds a wooden cot, a cracked wash basin, and a tiny wooden crucifix hanging on a nail. Some say the walls were once painted with saints, but now they only whisper mildew and the memory of incense. Outside, your bare feet slap against the stone corridor. Slap! Slap! Slap. The other monks are already emerging from their cells, their eyes half shut, forming a ghostly procession of yawning devotion. Nobody speaks. Nobody dares. That silence. It's not reverent, it's survival. The prior once gave a novice a week of latrine duty for whistling before matins. Down the hall, you go past the chapel's heavy oak doors toward the choir stalls where your day officially begins. Matins morning prayer is long, really long. You chant psalms until your throat feels like old parchment. Some monks' legends say sleep standing up while chanting. You suspect Brother Hugo is one of them. His mouth moves, but his eyes haven't opened since 1387. Here's the first historical fact of the night. Most monastic orders in the 15th century observed the divine office a strict schedule of prayers at regular intervals throughout the day and night. Matins was often held around 2 or 3 a.m. And yes, it lasted for hours. Imagine going to a church service so long it precedes sunrise. Your stomach groans halfway through Psalm 92, but food is still a long way off. The monks around you sway slightly in place. One novice is mouthing the words wrong, but no one corrects him. Not out of kindness, but out of sheer shared exhaustion. This part of your day is all about endurance, of the cold, of the hunger, and of Brother Elred's voice cracking mid-verse like a teen going through monastic puberty. The chapel smells of beeswax damp wool, and something that might be divine presence, or just really old stone. Candles flicker from wrought iron holders. The windows stained glass. If you're in a rich abbey are dark, offering no clue if the sun will ever rise again. Spoiler, it will, but slowly, as if even the universe finds mornings here unbearable. Quirky tidbit time. Some monks tied ropes to themselves during matins to keep from collapsing if they fell asleep standing. That's right, you're not just tired, you're essentially tethered like a medieval helium balloon of prayer. The last chant ends not with a crescendo, but a ragged exhale. You bow whisper an internal plea for warm porridge and file out with the others shuffling like penitential penguins toward whatever comes next. Historians still argue whether this relentless sleep deprivation was meant as true spiritual purification, or if medieval monks simply believed that fatigue brought them closer to the divine by sheer force of humility. One thing's for sure, you don't feel holy, you feel cold. And you'd trade 3 relics and a saint's toe bone for 5 more minutes in bed. But there's no time for dreaming, because the day has only just begun, and you've got 7 more hours of chanting, 3 hours of gardening, 2 of manuscript copying, and a full schedule of silent meals where someone reads aloud from a Latin text you don't even understand. Now, as the chapel doors creak open and the first gray smudge of dawn crawls across the courtyard, you stretch your aching back and think against all reason that maybe, just maybe this time, breakfast will include something other than porridge. It won't? You shuffle out of the chapel still barefoot into air so damp it feels like you're walking through a sponge. The corridor stones are cold and uneven, and one of them always tilts slightly under your left foot, an architectural flaw or a daily reminder of earthly suffering. You're not sure. You and your fellow monks form a quiet, hunched procession toward the refectory, but not for food, not yet. The next stop is Laud's, the second prayer service of the day, and it's somehow even colder in this part of the abbey. Your breath clouds in front of you as if you're exhaling ghosts. The sky outside the leaded windows is a grim watercolor of blue-gray, and the first birds haven't even bothered to sing yet. It's that deep post-night hush where time feels confused, and the human body definitely isn't designed to be conscious. You reach the chapel again and reassemble into rows. The benches creak as you sit. A junior monk lights the last of the candles and the room flares gently to life. The flame casts long shadows on the stone walls, flickering over faded frescoes and half-crumbled saints. The Latin begins again. You're meant to focus on the sacred texts. You're meant to open your soul to God. But your feet are freezing. The hem of your habit is damp from yesterday's storm, and you're trying not to nod off, because the prior watches everything. You count the verses like a prisoner marking days. Psalm 148, Psalm 149, Psalm 150 almost free. Your knees ache. The chapel floor is harder than any mattress you've ever slept on, and you kneel on it a dozen times a day. In winter, kneeling feels like dipping your bones in icy soup. In summer, well, in summer it just smells worse. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. Many 15th century monasteries required monks to go barefoot indoors as a form of humility and discipline. Sandals might be worn outside, but inside, especially in poorer abbeys, you're padding along stone floors with nothing but your calluses and your sins. By the time Lauds ends, your body has started to rebel. Your back protests with every movement, your fingers are stiff, and your stomach is audibly arguing with your ribs. When the prior gives the nod, his version of go, you don't walk, you scurry. The breakfast procession moves in single file to the refectory. You pass through the cloister where wind snakes through the arches and tries to steal what little warmth you've hoarded. One monk ahead of you sneezes and then immediately bows in penance. You're not sure if it's for interrupting the silence or for simply having mortal lungs. The refectory is long and dim with wooden benches and a great table stretching the length of the room. High on the wall, a faded fresco of the Last Supper watches you eat every day. Jesus looks permanently disappointed. The table is already set. Clay bowls, rough-spun napkins, and a loaf of black bread that could double as a doorstop. Here comes the fun part. Breakfast in complete silence. Except for one unlucky monk who has to stand at the lectern and read Latin scripture aloud while the rest of you eat. You never volunteered for that job, but it rotates. Your day is coming. Your meal arrives in a wooden bowl. Gray porridge again. It has the consistency of warm wallpaper paste and the charm of boiled socks. Occasionally, if the cook is feeling generous or distracted, there's a scrap of onion in it. You treasure those onion bits like gold. You eat slowly, carefully, trying not to scrape your spoon too loudly or slurp. Monks have been punished for less. One novice once coughed during grace and spent a week copying the same passage from Leviticus as penance. In Latin. Now for your quirky tidbit, some monasteries hired children called oblates to join as young as age 7, training them into full monastic life. These kids often had no idea what they were getting into. Imagine thinking you're getting adopted and instead finding yourself kneeling through matins with a Latin psalter and no dessert. You finish your porridge and sit up straight eyes forward. You can't leave the table until the reader finishes their passage and they're a slow reader. You watch a spider crawl across the ceiling and imagine it has a more exciting morning routine than you do. Historians still argue whether these early morning rituals were about true spiritual discipline or simply a way to micromanage idle time. Either way, you're not debating it. You're surviving it. At last, the lector closes the book. The prior taps twice on the table and you rise as one. The bowls are gathered, the spoons stacked, and the monks disperse like silent shadows to their next assigned task. Yours today, garden duty. Of course it is. You sigh, pull your hood tighter, and start the long walk to the herb beds. The day hasn't even begun in earnest, and already you've prayed for more hours than most people sleep. Your stomach's still rumbling. Your feet are still freezing. And Brother Gilbert just accidentally stepped on your robe. You do not curse, but you think it very hard. Out in the garden, the sky has finally shaken off the night, but the sunlight doesn't bring warmth, just clarity. You can now see how miserably cold everything is. Frost still clings to the cabbages like nature's dandruff, and the dirt is more frozen brick than soil. Welcome to your humble little patch of Eden. The monastery garden is split between practical herbs, humble vegetables, and a section dedicated to medicinal plants. You'll be pulling weeds from the carrot beds today, assuming you can actually distinguish the weeds from the carrots, which is not always obvious before the first cup of coffee. Just kidding, there's no coffee. Not for another 300 years. You kneel again. Your knees sigh in protest, and so do you, though only internally audibly sighing could be interpreted as spiritual weakness. You plunge your bare hands into the cold dirt and start yanking. The wind nips at your ears and the birds finally show up late as always and smug about it. A robin lands nearby and stares at you like you're the weird one. Which, to be fair, you kind of are. It's 6:45 in the morning and you're gardening in silence wearing a wool dress tied with rope. A few rows over, Brother Thomas hums very quietly under his breath. Gregorian chant, of course he's not reckless. You shoot him a glance that says, "We'll both be scrubbing the chamber pots if the prior hears that." He nods and gets back to weeding. Let's dig up a historical fact. Medieval monasteries were largely self-sufficient. Monks tended gardens, brewed ale, raised animals, and produced everything from candles to ink. You weren't just praying all day. You were running a pre-industrial farm and a copy shop all in one. The garden was sacred in its own way. Each plant had a purpose: mint for digestion, comfrey for bruises, leeks for winter stew, and nettles? Well, nettles were apparently for making your life awful. No one seems to remember why you're still growing them. Maybe it's penance. Everything might be penance. You pull up a suspicious root that smells like regret and wipe your hands on your habit. The prior walks by silent as a shadow, his hands tucked into his sleeves like a disappointed falcon. You nod deferentially. He nods back, though you're never entirely sure if it's a greeting or just the cold forcing his neck to lock. Here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. Some monastic orders, especially the stricter ones, imposed custody of the eyes, meaning monks were not allowed to let their gaze wander freely. You weren't supposed to look around, stare at the sky, or make meaningful eye contact with a particularly plump chicken. Eyes down, mind on God. The sun climbs slowly, but it never gets much warmer. You can feel the damp seeping through your knees, creeping up your spine like a whispered threat. Still, there's a rhythm to the work that borders on hypnotic. Pull toss, pull toss. Maybe you are praying just with your hands. Historians still argue whether this kind of labor was embraced as joyful humility or endured as quiet misery. One monk's divine simplicity is another monk's drafty cabbage patch. Eventually, the bell rings out its tone sharp and final. You straighten up your back, making a sound like a haunted door hinge. You rub your eyes, stretch your arms, and look down at the neat row of weedless soil. For a second, you feel proud. Then, you remember, this was only a third of the garden, and you'll be back here tomorrow pulling the same weeds that will magically return overnight. Medieval botany has no mercy. You trudge back toward the cloister hands, numb robes, damp, and with at least one earthworm still clinging to your sleeve, like a particularly clingy disciple. You flick it off gently and whisper, "Go in peace." You pass a novice carrying a wooden bucket of slops, and he looks at you with a mixture of awe and pity. You've been here longer. You've memorized more psalms. You've seen things, and you've still got 6 more prayers, 2 meals, and an eternity of manuscript copying before you can collapse back into your hay-stuffed mattress. But for now, you return inside, where candlelight flickers against stone, and the faint smell of warm ink drifts from the scriptorium. It's time to trade mud for manuscripts. You enter the scriptorium with dirt still under your nails and moss clinging to your hem. No time to wash, only time to scrape the mud off your soul and prepare your eyes for the slowest task known to mankind. Copying sacred texts by hand, one agonizing letter at a time. The room is hushed, but not silent. There's a constant ambient sound, quills scratching across parchment, the faint crackle of a fire kept low to preserve ink, and the occasional muffled cough that echoes off the stone walls like a guilty sneeze in a confessional. You find your seat, your stool hard, and unforgiving, your wooden writing desk angled upward like it resents you personally. Before you sits a sheet of stretched parchment calfskin, smooth and pale and absurdly expensive. You're reminded because the prior reminds you weekly that one careless ink blot is the spiritual equivalent of burning down a cathedral. No pressure. You dip your quill into the inkwell and begin. The letter A. Just one down. Only 20,000 more to go. Let's get the historical fact out of the way. In the 15th century, most monasteries still used hand copying to produce texts, even as the printing press was starting to gain traction. Gutenberg may have been shaking up the world, but your abbey's behind the times, technologically and emotionally. The quill squeaks. The ink smells of iron and vinegar. You pause between each word, not for thought, but for vigilance. One sneeze, one twitch, and your entire morning's work could become fire starter. Your assigned manuscript today is a psalter. You've copied Psalm 73 5 times in your life. You've thought deeply about it once. The rest of the time, you've focused mostly on not getting elbowed by Brother Piers, whose desk is so close, it might as well be a marital bed. The margins are to remain empty, completely, though you sometimes sneak a microscopic doodle, a flower, a bird, once a surprisingly well-proportioned rabbit. If discovered, you'd face penance, but somehow the little rabbit remains safe in the folds of Psalm 38, peeking from the corner like a fluffy witness to spiritual decay. Your back starts to ache, not from labor, but from sitting so rigidly still. The bench is a medieval chiropractic joke. Your fingers cramp from gripping the quill too tightly. You forgot to file the nib properly, so your strokes are a little too wet today, but fixing it would mean asking for the knife, and you'd rather endure ink blobs than the shame of interrupting the quiet flow of the room. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monks had personal writing tools they named like Faithful Friend or Saint Scribbles. Yours? You've secretly named your quill the Eternal Itch because it mostly drives you insane. Brother Bernard suddenly clears his throat, a low rumble that startles everyone. The prior looks up. Nothing is said, but Bernard will be assigned latrine cleaning tomorrow. Everyone knows. It's the unspoken law of acoustic justice. Your eyes start to blur. The candlelight wavers with each breath of wind through the high window. You blink, then blink again. Time warps in the scriptorium. 1 hour feels like a day. 3 lines of Latin feels like the script for an opera. Your hand cramps again. You wiggle your fingers under the desk, trying not to cry out or sob audibly. That's also frowned upon. Now comes the debate. Historians still argue whether monks found joy in this act of devotion or simply numbed themselves into compliance. Was the repetition meditative like prayer through muscle memory? Or was it quiet misery wrapped in piety? You suspect both are true. Today, definitely the latter. At one point, you glance up and see a moth drifting lazily across the air drawn to the candlelight. You envy it. It has wings. It can leave. You, meanwhile, are stuck debating whether that smudge on the parchment is dirt or divine punishment. After 2 hours, you've finished a page and a half. That's a good pace. You flex your shoulder until it pops. Stretch your neck until something snaps. Hopefully not eternal salvation, and set the quill down with reverence and relief. A bell tolls faintly from the courtyard. It's time for the midday meal. You blow gently across your ink to dry it, close the protective sheet over your work, and bow slightly to the page, as tradition requires. You gather your tools, quill knife, pumice, stone, and inkwell, and return them to the shared chest. The eternal itch gets one last flick of affection before being tucked away. You file out with the others, your joints stiff, your soul flatter, and your mouth dry from sheer concentration. A fellow monk pats your shoulder as you pass and mutters, "That D on line 7 is a bit fat." You say nothing, but you note it. Tonight, that monk's pillow may mysteriously smell of nettles. Back in the refectory, food awaits. But don't get too excited. You already know what it is. You step back into the refectory with aching shoulders and fingers that feel like they've been forged into tiny claws. The midday bell is still echoing off the stone arches as you file to your usual spot on the bench. Lower yourself carefully, because everything hurts, and glance down at the table. There it is again. Porridge. You shouldn't be surprised, and yet somehow you still are. It's different than breakfast porridge, allegedly. This version has more texture. Perhaps a chopped parsnip made a brief appearance. One can dream. You bow your head as grace is murmured, then reach for your wooden spoon with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man reaching for his final turnip. Around you, the brothers eat in complete silence, broken only by the lector's voice booming across the chamber, reading from a Latin tract about humility or chastity, or, ironically, fasting. You're never quite sure because your Latin is limited and you're too hungry to translate. Here's your historical fact. Monks followed a rule-bound life, often dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict. Meals were taken in silence, accompanied by scripture readings, and meat was usually forbidden unless you were sick elderly or accidentally caught a very chicken-shaped fish. You chew the porridge with dignified boredom. It tastes like hot glue and penance. Occasionally you fantasize about butter. Not even good butter, just a smear of slightly rancid monastery butter would feel like divine intervention. Brother Hugo across from you is struggling to stay awake. His eyes keep closing mid-chew. You watch fascinated as he nods forward just a little too far and nearly face-plants into his bowl. He catches himself at the last second with a sharp inhale, which earns him a stern glance from the prior. Not a word is spoken, but judgment radiates off these benches like heat from a forge. There's a moment of excitement when a small beetle crawls across the table near your spoon. It's the most animated thing you've seen in hours. One of the novices tries to flick it away, only to miss and accidentally knock his spoon to the floor. He stares in frozen horror. A second of silence passes. The lector continues. Then, the novice slowly, reverently retrieves the spoon, dusts it off with his robe, and resumes eating. You all pretend not to notice. That, too, is part of monastic charity. Time stretches in the refectory. You eat slowly because there's nothing else to do, and you're trying to delay the inevitable. More prayers, more labor, and the lingering fear that you'll be assigned latrine duty for insufficient enthusiasm during psalm recitation. Let's drop a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries had silent signal systems like coughing in a certain rhythm or using hand gestures to communicate discreetly during meals. It's the medieval version of texting. You once saw a brother communicate this: porridge is cursed using only eyebrow movements. It was flawless. As you scrape the last of your lunch from the bowl, still warm somehow, like a small mercy, you realize your throat is parched. Water is passed down the table in a shared wooden cup. You take one sip carefully, avoiding the smudge of beard grease on the rim. Holy water may purify the soul, but this builds immunity through sheer microbial warfare. Now for your scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether monastic diets genuinely promoted health or merely survival. Some claim the simplicity and fasting extended lifespans. Others note the rampant cases of anemia, dental decay, and gout. You think both sides have a point, and your knees would like a word. After the lector finishes reading mercifully, the prior taps the table twice, and you all rise. The bowls are gathered. The lector bows. Everyone files out again in ghostly silence, returning to their respective duties. You glance longingly at the fire pit in the corner, unused during meals except on feast days. Maybe next week. Maybe. You head down the cloister corridor, feet dragging slightly, robes brushing the stones in slow rhythm. A breeze whistles through the arches, catching you in just the right angle to chill your lower back. You shudder and mutter a silent prayer for warmth. God apparently is not in the heating business. Still, it's not the worst part of the day. Not yet. That comes next. Confession. You head toward the small stone chamber tucked behind the chapel where the walls are thick. The air stale and secrets hang in the rafters like cobwebs. It's time for confession, a regular part of monastic life, though you often feel you haven't done enough interesting things to confess. The queue is already forming. Quiet monks, eyes lowered, hands clasped, all waiting to unload their spiritual lint into the prior's ear. Brother Anselm's face is twisted in a knot of guilt so intense you'd think he set the monastery on fire. He didn't. That was Brother Elias in 1411. You take your place at the back, shuffle forward one monk at a time, and try to recall anything remotely sinful from the past week. You haven't spoken out of turn. You didn't steal anything. And most impressively, you didn't kick Brother Gilbert when he fell asleep on your foot during Vespers. But still, you must confess something. A minute later, you step into the tiny booth. There's no screen, just the prior seated like a stone statue behind a small table. He gives you a long look, equal parts exhaustion and holiness. You kneel. He raises an eyebrow, not in judgment, but in expectation. And so you confess. I fell asleep during Psalm 63 and dreamed I was eating roasted goose. Also, I may have judged the porridge harshly, and I used the word useless in my mind when describing the Abbey mule. He nods solemnly. 5 prayers of penance. Reflect on the virtue of humility. You nod back because what else can you do? Here's your historical fact. Medieval monks were required to confess frequently, often weekly, and sometimes daily, depending on the order. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized obedience, humility, and continual self-correction. Even daydreams could be viewed as spiritual failings. You exit the booth lighter somehow, though. Perhaps that's just the relief of not having to invent worse sins. You return to your shared sleeping quarters for the midday rest. It's not exactly a nap. Technically, it's a contemplative pause, but most monks use it as a desperate attempt to close their eyes without being caught. You lower yourself onto the straw-stuffed mattress, scratchy, lumpy, but better than nothing. The blanket smells faintly of mildew and sheep. Across the narrow aisle, Brother Gilbert is already snoring like a dying bellows. Loud, rhythmic, tragic. You try to sleep. You really do. But every time you drift off, Gilbert inhales like he's summoning demons. You sit up. You sigh. You consider repenting again, just for the thoughts you're thinking about him. Quirky tidbit time. Snoring monks were a known problem in the Middle Ages. Some monasteries placed loud sleepers at the far end of the dormitory. Others, less kind, placed them near the latrines as divine punishment. Your abbey takes the communal suffering builds virtue approach. You pull your blanket tighter and lie still, eyes closed, mentally rehearsing a psalm in hopes that holiness will knock you unconscious. It doesn't. Instead, your mind wanders to ridiculous things. Whether St. Jerome would have kicked Gilbert, whether porridge counts as a trial sent by God, and whether your soul is slowly turning into parchment. Historians still argue whether this midday pause was designed for genuine rest or enforced stillness to prevent idle wandering. Some claim monks emerged refreshed. Others, like you, emerged tenser, angrier, and with a deeper appreciation for the sweet mercy of noise-canceling moss. Eventually, the bell rings. Again. You swing your legs off the bed, step into your sandals, hallelujah, and head back out into the cloister. Next up, your turn at the pulpit, which means standing in front of all the other monks and reading a dusty sermon aloud while they nap in their seats. You can already feel the irony tightening around your neck, like a rope made of irony. The wooden pulpit wobbles slightly beneath your elbows. It's not meant for comfort, nothing here is. The scroll before you is thick, faded, and smells faintly of cabbage, as many well-loved books do in this abbey. The sermon you're about to read is titled, "The Evils of Excessive Gaiety." You already know it will not be a crowd pleaser. The prior gives you a nod. That's your cue. You begin. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Philip, a great joy spread through the lands, and with it came corruption, mirth, and unseemly dancing. You try to project your voice without sounding like you care. The trick is to appear reverent while also emotionally detached enough that if someone snores audibly, you won't feel personally insulted. And someone does. 2 lines in, Brother Gilbert naturally lets out a sound like a small trumpet being stepped on. A few heads twitch. One monk coughs with deliberate volume, not because he's sick, but because monk passive aggression is subtle and performative. You read on. Here's your historical fact. Monastic sermons, especially in the later Middle Ages, often drew on cautionary tales, saintly examples, and deeply moralizing themes. They were read aloud daily, sometimes multiple times, and not just to inspire, but to instruct and correct. You stumble over a word concupiscence and correct yourself. No one reacts. Half the monks are pretending to listen. The other half are praying, "You'll finish quickly." The prior from his corner seat watches with lizard-like stillness. You imagine he's mentally ranking your performance, preparing a note. Voice too thin. Over-enunciates sin. You read for 30 minutes straight. Your throat dries up like overcooked gruel. Your legs go numb. You shift your weight slightly and the pulpit creaks. It sounds louder than your soul. You insert one tiny deviation for your own amusement. Instead of "he who walks without vigilance," you say "he who walks without socks." No one notices. Tragic. Here's your quirky tidbit. A few mischievous monks throughout history are known to have slipped jokes, puns, or personal jabs into readings. One 14th century monk copied an entire psalm upside down after being reprimanded for messy handwriting. It still exists. It's glorious. Eventually, the final sentence arrives like a gift from heaven. May the soul which flees joy find peace in solemn silence. You step down. Your knees crack. A few monks cross themselves in appreciation or possibly relief. Historians still argue whether these sermon readings were actually absorbed by the audience or simply served as background noise, while monks practiced advanced techniques in subtle sleeping. Based on the gentle snoring now trailing off, you lean toward the latter. You walk back to your place in the choir. Stalls sit and try not to look too pleased with yourself. Brother Gilbert is drooling slightly, and you feel no Christian guilt about this. After the reading, you have a rare stretch of unstructured time, just 30 minutes or so, but you decide to take the secret route. Every monk has one. The hidden shortcut through the herb garden that gives you 5 extra minutes of silence, sunlight, and relative solitude. You slip away from the cloister and through a crumbling arch half hidden by ivy. The garden smells of thyme, sage, and honest dirt. Bees drift lazily through the air, ignoring you completely. And for a moment, you feel like a human again, not a praying machine. You pause at the rosemary. It's technically for the apothecary, but you pluck a sprig anyway and tuck it in your sleeve. The scent clears your head better than any sermon. This is the holiest moment of your day, until you hear sandals scuffing the path behind you. You turn guilty and see Brother Peter. He raises an eyebrow. You raise both in return. A silent pact. He nods, says nothing, and continues walking. You'll both pretend this didn't happen, because technically you're not supposed to be here. Technically it's unscheduled. And technically you don't care. You sit on a low stone wall, rosemary in hand, and breathe in the smell of something alive, that isn't boiled. Historians still argue whether monks carved out these stolen moments out of desperation or simple instinct for balance. You argue silently internally that even saints need 5 minutes of fresh air and disobedience. The bell rings in the distance. Time's up. You brush your robe clean, smooth your hair, and make your way back through the herb beds, back into the cloister's long shadows, back into the fold. You are once again a monk, but for a moment, you weren't. You're just rounding the final corner of the cloister, trying to look like you haven't been sneaking through forbidden lavender patches, when you hear the clatter of a wooden bucket and the unmistakable hiss of a goose. It's time for animal chores. You sigh, not out of rebellion, not even exhaustion, but a kind of spiritual resignation. You faced eternal damnation, inner temptation, and 37 hours of chanting this week alone, but none of that compares to the wrath of Sister Agnes, the Abbey's most violent goose. She's waiting by the coop. First, though, the chickens. You unlatch the pen and step into the straw-strewn enclosure where the hens bob and strut like judgmental nobles. You scatter cracked grain from a wicker basket and they descend like feathered thunder. You know them all by personality now. There's Griselda, who always bites fingers, Henricus, who looks vaguely evil, and Mildred, your favorite, who once chased a rat under the altar and won a silent ovation. The chickens eat. They are satisfied. You are not, because now you must milk the goat. The goat's name is Matilda. She is old blind in one eye and takes personal offense at being touched. You crouch down, place the bucket, and offer a prayer to Saint Blaise, patron of sore throats and hopefully minor livestock miracles. Squirt, squirt, kick. You dodge the hoof. A monk nearby chuckles. You glance over Brother Thomas. He's feeding the pigs and grinning like a child who knows you got assigned goose duty today. And right on cue, a hiss. Sister Agnes has arrived. She is plump, loud, and possessed by whatever spirit haunted medieval battlefield generals. Her wings flap once. You meet her eyes. There is no mercy in them. You try the trick approach. Sideways, speak softly. Don't make sudden movements. Agnes doesn't care. Agnes charges. You sidestep. She bites your robe. You squeal unmonkly. She wins. Here's your historical fact. Monastic communities in the 15th century often maintained their own animals for eggs, milk, and meat. Caring for them was part of the daily labor expected of brothers and novices alike. Though cloistered from the world, monks still mucked stalls and dodged angry poultry. Eventually, you managed to distract Sister Agnes with a piece of bread crust from lunch. Naturally, you saved it for this exact reason. While she hisses in triumph, you collect the eggs and flee with the dignity of a man who's been thoroughly outwitted by a goose. Back inside the cloister kitchen, the air is warm and smells of hay and yeast. You pass off the eggs, the milk, and a single wilted beet someone unearthed from the garden. Brother Ambrose nods in thanks and goes back to stirring a pot of something that looks like regret and tastes worse. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some abbeys reportedly gave certain animals names and titles, treating long-lived goats or cats as unofficial members of the order. One Benedictine abbey kept a cat named Prior Whiskers. He allegedly had a better attendance record than most novices. You return to the washing area to scrub your hands. A sliver of goat hair sticks to your sleeve. Your robe is now marked with the distinctive mud of both chicken coop and goose battlefield. You splash cold water onto your face, flinch, and mentally prepare for the next step. Vespers, evening prayers. Historians still argue whether animal chores were seen as holy service or just necessary drudgery beneath layers of spiritual justification. Probably both. After all, someone had to clean the donkey stall, and it certainly wasn't Saint Benedict himself. The sky outside has gone golden low sun slipping through narrow windows and washing the stone walls with light. You pause for a moment in the corridor, warmed just slightly by that light. Your arms ache. Your foot has a small goose bruise, and your back is still damp from goat milk. But somehow that feels closer to real grace than most of the chanting. You walk slowly toward the chapel again. One more round of prayer. One more psalm. One more chance to stay awake through Brother Gilbert's sleepy drone. As you step through the archway, Candlelight flickers along the choir stalls, and the incense has already been lit. The monks take their places silent as shadows. You close your eyes, breathe in, and prepare to chant again. The chapel is dim now, lit by low rows of beeswax candles that flicker like tired eyelids. Shadows stretch across the flagstones, long and thin, reaching up toward the vaulted ceiling like spectral fingers trying to escape the prayers below. Vespers is about to begin. You take your place in the choir stalls once more, your body aching in that special way it only does when you've been up since 3 B. Fought a goat, dodged a goose, and copied a psalm until your hand forgot how to form letters. You kneel again. Your knees by now are negotiating a ceasefire with your soul. The bell tolls. Once. Twice. 3 times. The prior gives a slight nod and the chanting begins. You join in. Deus in adjutorium, meum intenda. It pours out of you like fog across a moor. Slow, somber, slightly off-key in the best traditions of communal suffering. Here's your historical fact. Vespers was one of the major components of the divine office, the structured cycle of daily prayers observed by monks across medieval Europe. Usually held at sunset, Vespers was a time of reflection, repentance, and surrender of the day's labors to God. Tonight's psalms are long. Of course they are. Psalm 89 alone feels like a punishment disguised as a lullaby. You chant alongside your brothers, occasionally noticing who is struggling to keep pace. Brother Marcus beside you has developed a rhythm somewhere between sacred and snore. You gently nudge his elbow. The incense curls through the air, sweet and smoky, a mild consolation for the cold stone beneath you. You inhale deeply and promptly cough. So does Brother Gilbert. The prior shoots both of you a look that could curdle milk. And yet, there's something peaceful here. Even amid the cold, the repetition, and the burn in your calves from prolonged kneeling, there's a strange steadiness to it. The words are old, older than your abbey, older than your bones, and in repeating them you feel briefly rooted in something far bigger than yourself. The chant ends. The candles hiss as they drip. The prior intones a short closing prayer, his voice even and low. You bow, rise slowly, and make your way out into the hallway, feet dragging slightly. And now your reward. Free time. Well, technically it's not called free time. It's evening contemplation, which means you sit quietly in the dormitory and pretend to be thinking about salvation, while everyone else quietly gossips about Brother Cuthbert's foot fungus. You trudge back to the shared dormitory. It's a large stone room with wooden bunks, hay-filled mattresses, and the distinct smell of wool sweat and sanctified exhaustion. Candles are kept low to preserve wax, so you navigate by familiarity, dodging familiar creaky floorboards and the occasional rogue slipper. You collapse onto your bed, groaning slightly, a sound you immediately try to pass off as a whispered prayer. Now for the quirky tidbit. Many monasteries in the 15th century kept monks in shared sleeping quarters with minimal privacy. Curtains were rare and personal belongings were discouraged. However, some monks became quite inventive, using ink pots as candle holders, hiding dried fruit in hollowed-out psalters, or even sewing secret pockets into their habits for illicit morsels of cheese. Brother Gilbert climbs into the bunk across from yours and immediately sighs the way only a man who has eaten 4 consecutive porridge meals can sigh. You close your eyes. Perhaps you will drift off, perhaps not. That's when the whispers begin. Monk gossip. It starts softly, just 1 or 2 voices murmuring about the prior's cracked sandals, and whether they imply divine neglect or simply a stubborn refusal to accept cobbler assistance. Another voice chimes in about Brother Alaric's miraculous turnip harvest, which may or may not have involved extra fertilizer and borrowing some from the goose pen. You raise an eyebrow, eyes still closed. Scandal. You don't participate, of course, but you listen. Historians still argue whether monks were truly silent outside of prayer times or simply learned to gossip creatively through gestures, well-timed coughs, or whispered conversations in the far corners of the dormitory. Based on the animated whisper near your left ear, you're inclined to believe the latter. Someone nearby mutters about the upcoming fast and how Brother Thomas has allegedly been hoarding apples. You file this information away, not out of judgment, just strategic interest. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cuts through the dark. Who used all the footbath herbs? Silence. Then shuffling. Then an unmistakable voice. They weren't labeled. Brother Marcus. Caught. Again. You crack one eye open and meet the gaze of Brother Julian across the aisle. He grins. You stifle a laugh behind your sleeve. Technically a sin. Totally worth it. The candles are extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint golden embers of the hearth and the muted sound of someone snoring already. You lie back the straw, poking your ribs in 5 places, your feet slightly chilled your soul, weirdly content. You whisper a single unofficial prayer. Lord, grant me strength not to strangle Gilbert before sunrise. And then sleep comes. You wake not to a bell, but to the absence of it, a small mercy. It's your turn for night watch, which means your hour of sleep just ended and your hour of trudging in silence through dim corridors is about to begin. You rise quietly, careful not to disturb Brother Julian, who sleeps with his mouth open and dreams loudly about who knows what. You grab your cloak from its peg, wrapping it tight to fend off the chill. Even the candles seem reluctant to stay awake at this hour. Most have guttered down to sad little puddles of wax. Outside the dormitory, the abbey is quiet in a way that feels ancient. The silence here isn't just the absence of noise. It's layered thick, like a heavy wool blanket soaked in centuries. Your sandals slap softly against the stone as you begin your patrol lantern in hand, flame low and flickering, like it too wishes it were in bed. This isn't just a security routine. It's a spiritual duty, an act of vigil, of guardianship, of readiness. You're watching for fire, for intruders, for signs of divine visitation. Or mice. Mostly mice. Here's your historical fact. Night watches were common in many monastic orders. They served both practical and symbolic functions, ensuring the safety of the abbey, and also reflecting Christ's admonition to keep watch and remain spiritually alert, even in darkness. Monks took shifts, often rotating weekly. You pass the chapel doors and pause, placing your hand on the cold wood. Inside it's completely dark now. No chanting, no incense, just memory clinging to the pews. You whisper a line from the Psalms, mostly out of habit, partly out of fear that if you don't, something in the shadows might answer first. You continue along the cloister walk. The moonlight filters through the arches in pale silver beams, casting long shadows across the worn flagstones. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots a sound that somehow manages to feel both holy and sarcastic. You check the storeroom where sacks of grain sit like slumbering monks in burlap robes. You glance at the kitchen, empty, except for the eternal presence of Brother Ambrose's cauldron still faintly steaming. You wonder not for the first time whether he ever sleeps. Halfway through your route, you stop by the herb garden again. It's different at night, smaller, quieter, as though the plants themselves are praying. You crush a sprig of lavender between your fingers just to smell something that isn't mildew or damp wool. For a moment, you stand still, listening to the wind hum through the rosemary like a secret being whispered over centuries. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some monks believed that certain herbs, especially lavender and rue, could ward off demons and temptations. Whether or not that's true, they certainly ward off boredom when you're pacing alone under a sky that looks like ink spattered with stars. You return to the cloister and continue your loop. The lantern's flame dances against the walls, illuminating bits of medieval graffiti, small scratched crosses, initials, and once a fish with what might be a halo. You hope it was a joke? You also kind of hope it wasn't. Historians still argue whether the solitude of these night hours helped monks draw closer to God, or simply gave them time to rehearse complaints they were too holy to voice during the day. You personally have composed an entire mental treatise on why porridge should be a seasonal indulgence, not a lifestyle. As your hour draws to a close, you pass the dormitory again. Everyone inside is asleep or pretending to be. You open the door as quietly as a man burdened by a creaky hinge can. You return your lantern, hang up your cloak, and slide under your scratchy blanket. The bed feels twice as hard after having left it. The straw pokes a fresh constellation into your shoulder blade. Across from you, Brother Gilbert mumbles something about geese and justice in his sleep. You roll over away from the sound and close your eyes. This is monastic life. You wake in the dark. You work in silence. You chant until your voice becomes muscle memory. You pray until you forget where your thoughts end and the psalms begin. You labor. You forgive. You repeat. And then, if you're lucky, you sleep just long enough to do it all again tomorrow. The next morning begins the same way as always, with that cold, heartless bell shattering your dreams into pieces. No rooster, no sunbeam gently rousing you, just clang, 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 like the monastery itself is shaking you by the soul and shouting, "Up, pray." Now, you sit up. Everything hurts. Your back from night watch, your knees from yesterday's garden duty, and your dignity, which never quite recovered from the goose ambush. You slip on your sandals and shuffle into the hallway, joining the bleary-eyed parade of brothers heading toward matins like penitents in a particularly grim passion play. By now, your brain doesn't even try to resist. It simply lifts the next psalm off the internal shelf and begins reciting like a record player stuck in divine repeat mode. Deus in adjutorium meum intende. You chant, you kneel, you stand, you kneel again. A choreography as old as dust. Later, after another breakfast of porridge, this time with 2 lumps, you find yourself reassigned to a task you've been secretly dreading. Laundry. Yes, it's laundry day, which in monastic terms means hauling heavy tunics and robes to the freezing stone wash house, slapping them against flat rocks with a vigor that might be mistaken for anger, and trying not to think about what's soaking in that water besides soapworty. Let's hit a historical fact while you're scrubbing. Monasteries in the 15th century were meticulous about cleanliness, at least for their time. Many had dedicated washhouses or even early plumbing systems. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed weekly baths, shared clothing, and regular laundering, especially for undergarments. Hygiene, while primitive, was still taken seriously. Of course, that doesn't make it pleasant. You lug the linen robes, habits, and rough woolen socks, some of which seem to predate the abbey itself, down to the trough. Brother Anselm is already there, sleeves rolled to his elbows and covered in soap suds. He gives you the tired nod of a man who's washed every sock in Christendom and seen things he cannot unsee. The water is ice cold. Your hands go numb within seconds. You slap the robes against the stone one after the other, trying not to splash your habit, though it's already damp from earlier chores. One robe in particular has an unidentifiable crust along the hem, and you try not to speculate. You will not ask. You will not know. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some monasteries believed that physical labor like laundry had purifying effects, not just on garments, but on the soul. There are actual sermons comparing soap to grace and scrubbing to penance. You're fairly certain your soul is currently soaking in the same water as Brother Gilbert's foot towels. You try not to draw conclusions from that. Midway through the chore, a novice slips on a bar of tallow soap and crashes into the trough, robes and all. You manage not to laugh aloud, just a faint snort. Just a moment. And of course, Brother Bernard saw it. He peers at you from beneath those bushy eyebrows, the weight of monastic law behind him. You bow slightly. You do not laugh again. But later, you will whisper the story to Brother Julian with great dramatic flair. And then splash, like St. John in reverse. Historians still argue whether the strict routines of monastery life helped foster community or crushed individuality. You suspect it does both. You are a stone among many in a very large wall. But every now and then, one stone tilts slightly and something grows in the crack. After laundry, you hang the robes to dry in the cloister walkway. The sun, rare and glorious, filters through the arches. The habits flap gently in the breeze like the wings of very tired angels. You stand there for a moment, just breathing. No prayers, no chanting. Just wind and wool and your raw red fingers. Then the bell rings again. Of course it does. You trudge off to the next prayer service, dripping slightly. On the way, Brother Gilbert catches up to you and says softly, "I heard about the soap incident." You look at him. I said nothing. He smiles. Laughter is the first sign of heresy. You both walk on in silence. friends in the quietest possible sense. The afternoon sun drapes the abbey in gold, softening the sharp edges of stone walls and lighting up every dust mote floating through the air like little saints on pilgrimage. It would almost be beautiful if you weren't headed straight into your next assignment, helping with repairs to the west cloister wall. You sigh, shift your aching shoulders, and follow Brother Alaric to the work shed, where wooden tools hang like torture instruments from pegs, and the smell of damp rope and old timber is thicker than incense on Easter. "Take the mallet," he mutters, "and don't chip the bricks again." The prior noticed last time. That's fair. You did chip the bricks, but in your defense, medieval masonry is a cruel, unforgiving mistress. Today's task: re-mortar a crumbling section of wall that even the ivy gave up on. You haul the stone up one at a time, spreading thick lime mortar with a trowel that's older than your robe. Your hands are already blistered from yesterday's goat wrangling and laundry, but no one asks, and you wouldn't dare mention it. Here's your historical fact. Many monasteries functioned like self-contained villages, with monks taking turns in roles like carpenter, mason, scribe, and even brewer. Abbeys often built and repaired their own structures, sometimes over generations. A monk could literally die laying the foundation for a wall he'd never see finished. You are that monk today. The sun bakes your back while you work, but not in a pleasant, summery way. It's the kind of heat that seeps through wool and lingers in your spine like penance. Sweat trickles down your brow and lands right in your eye. You blink. You do not complain. Brother Alaric hums while he works. Gregorian chant as always. You catch yourself humming too, and together you achieve a kind of disjointed harmony that sounds like two bees arguing in Latin. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some monks left cryptic carvings in the stonework of monasteries' faces, animals, or weird hybrid creatures hidden among the floral motifs. Entire academic papers have been written about whether one particular carving at a Yorkshire abbey is a lion or just a really judgmental house cat. You sneak a glance at the wall you're working on, and with the tip of your trowel, carve the world's smallest snail into the mortar between stones. Just a curve, just a shell. No one will ever notice, except maybe another bored monk 100 years from now. And they'll laugh, quietly, because joy is still allowed if you keep it subtle. Historians still argue whether these quiet acts of rebellion were tolerated by abbey leadership or simply overlooked in the name of sanity. Either way, they exist, and they matter more than anyone admits. The work drags on for hours. You lift, you smear, you press, you sweat. Your back screams, your fingers ache. You stop only once to stretch, and maybe to send up a brief whispered prayer for carpenters, stonemasons, and chiropractors. Finally, Brother Alaric taps your shoulder and says, "Good enough." That's the highest praise available in monk masonry. You nod. You both stand there for a moment staring at your work. It's crooked. It leans. It's solid enough. God sees the inside, he says. You don't know what that means, but you nod again anyway. You wash your hands in a basin filled with grimy water and return the tools to the shed, placing them back on their pegs like relics of some ancient ritual. Then it's off again, this time to the kitchen where you've been assigned fire-stoking duty for the evening. You descend the narrow stone stair into the kitchen's shadowy depths, where the hearth glows like a dragon's breath and the heat hugs your face like a smothering wool blanket. Brother Ambrose is already there, chopping onions with the dead-eyed calm of a man who hasn't cried in 30 years, except while chopping onions. You gather kindling, stoke the fire, and add logs until it crackles like Judgment Day. The smell of root vegetables, stale herbs, and whatever the heck Brother Ambrose just dropped in the pot fills the room. "Parsnips," he says. "Probably." You nod. You stir. You let the warmth soak into your bones, burning out the chill from the stone walls and sore muscles alike. The dinner bell rings faintly above you. Time for another silent meal, another recitation of something terrifying in Latin, another bowl of probably parsnip, and maybe, just maybe, a slice of dried apple if Brother Marcus hasn't bartered them all away for more footbath herbs. You trudge up the steps, hands still smelling of ash, your robe dusted with flour, and your soul just a tiny bit lighter than it was this morning. Evening is here again, though time in the Abbey feels less like a progression and more like a cycle. A wheel you keep turning whether you're ready or not. The dinner bell tolls as the sky darkens, calling you back to the refectory for what will be your 4th bowl of stew this week. Maybe 5th. You've lost count. You've lost many things, time feeling in your left foot, and the will to get excited about turnips. Tonight's dinner smells faintly edible. That's promising. You sit in your usual spot back, straight eyes forward, as the lector begins reading from the life of Saint Crispin. The tale of a cobbler turned martyr, which frankly you've heard 6 times already, and could probably summarize better than the poor monk mumbling it aloud right now. Here's your historical fact. Many monastic communities rotated a library of devotional readings during meals, biographies of saints, theological essays, or lengthy sermons. The goal was to nourish body and soul simultaneously. Whether your soul was inspired or just mildly annoyed depended on the lector's volume and pronunciation. You spoon up a grayish-brown mixture of lentils, barley, and mysterious floating bits. Could be onion, could be... No, it's definitely onion. Still, your stomach accepts it with the kind of joy reserved for small mercies. The reading drones on about St. Crispin being flayed for his faith, right as you chew a particularly tough chunk of something that might once have been a potato. You try not to draw parallels. Then comes the quirky tidbit. In some abbeys, monks would communicate silently during meals using hand signs, an improvised form of monastic sign language. Over time, dozens of gestures emerged. A flick of the wrist for bread, a tap on the chest for "I've sinned," and allegedly a discreet nose scratch for "Please pass the salt." Of course, salt is rare, but nose scratches are eternal. Across from you, Brother Julian raises an eyebrow and subtly nudges a piece of dark bread your way. You accept it like contraband in a prison movie. Swift, silent, grateful. Friendship forged in crumbs is real. The lector finishes. A final prayer is said, and just like that, you rise with the others and shuffle off into evening silence. But tonight, there's something different on the schedule. Bath time. Yes, monks bathed. Occasionally, communally, and never joyfully. The bathhouse is a long, echoing room of stone tubs, steaming cauldrons, and half-hearted privacy. It smells of soapwort, wet wool, and faint embarrassment. You shed your habit, fold it, and lower yourself into the shallow, lukewarm pool, trying not to hiss as your goosebite brushes the water. Agnes left a mark. You're not alone. Monks sit quietly in the murky pools, washing their hair with lye soap and trying not to make eye contact. Brother Gilbert hums softly. You pray it's not contagious. Here's where the real humility kicks in. Because as holy as you try to be, there's nothing quite like scrubbing your underarms next to the prior who is gently explaining the theological symbolism of the ribcage. You rinse. You soak. You emerge looking slightly more human and significantly more pruny. You dry off with rough spun linen that feels like a sandpaper hug, then return to your cell skin pink and spirit slightly dampened. Historians still argue whether these communal baths were about health discipline or simply appeasing the rising tide of monkfoot fungus. Some orders bathed weekly, others monthly. You've never been brave enough to ask which your abbey follows. Back in your cell, the flickering candle throws shadows across your cot. You dress in your second habit dryer, less muddy but equally coarse. You sit for a moment, combing your hair with a bone-handled comb passed down by 4 previous monks, each of whom etched their initials into the handle. You think of them, wonder if they hated the porridge too. Then comes Compline. Final prayer. Final chant. Final time Brother Gilbert bumps your elbow. You return to the chapel one last time, the flicker of firelight already waiting. The monks gather like worn pages bound by rhythm and rule. You chant soft now, almost a whisper, a lullaby to the day itself begging it to sleep. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. The service ends. A hush falls. The candles are snuffed. You walk back to your cell through darkness so thick it feels alive. Tonight, there's no night watch. Tonight, you sleep. Your cell greets you like an old friend with no sense of humor. Cold stone walls, A straw-stuffed mattress that sags like it's questioning its own purpose. One flickering candle that really shouldn't be left unattended, but you do anyway, just for a moment of soft light before the dark swallows everything again. You sit on the edge of your cot and breathe, deeply, slowly. For the first time all day, you aren't chanting, scrubbing, digging, or silently chewing something fibrous. You're simply being, which in a monastery feels almost rebellious. Outside, the wind rattles the leaded glass panes, and the owl that lives near the belfry gives its nightly scream a sound that somehow manages to be both majestic and extremely personal. You sigh. You stretch. You scratch an itch on your shoulder that might be divine judgment or just leftover soap. This is your time. You open your psalter not for duty, but because it's the only book you're allowed to have, and by now it's comfort food. The pages are thumb-worn, smudged at the corners, and faintly scented with candle smoke and the oil from your fingertips. You've read these psalms 1,000 times, but some lines still land like a bell tolling directly inside your chest. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. It's a nice thought, a hopeful one, especially after fighting a goose. Here's your historical fact. Personal devotion was encouraged alongside communal prayer. Monks were often expected to read or memorize scripture during their minimal free time. Psalters were prized possessions, sometimes even carried to the grave, clasped in lifeless hands as symbols of spiritual dedication. You close the book gently and rest it beside your bed. Then comes the ritual of final checks. You adjust your sandals at the foot of the cot, fold your outer robe neatly, and tuck your bone-handled comb into the hollow of a loose stone in the wall, your private hiding spot. Every monk has one. The candle burns lower. You blow it out with a soft f, and darkness rushes in like a tide. You lie back. But sleep, of course, does not come quickly. The mattress crackles beneath you. Somewhere a mouse rustles in the wall. From 3 cells over, Brother Marcus begins what will be a long symphonic night of murmured dreams and intermittent sleep prayers. You close your eyes, reopen them. Try counting psalms, try counting geese. And that's when you hear it. A whisper, very faint. Who moved my foot wrap? You suppress a laugh. Quirky tidbit time. Despite vows of silence, monks often developed an entire system of nighttime communication. Quiet throat clears, mattress creaks, the shifting of blankets, all rich with meaning. A single cough could mean, "Are you awake?" 2. Do you have a splinter remedy? 3. Did you just fart? Historians still argue whether this informal language was tolerated or silently condemned. But when you live side by side in eternal silence, even shared misery becomes a kind of fellowship. The night stretches long and cold. Sleep comes in fits. You dream of matins bells, of leaking ink, of porridge bowls that never empty, and goats that quote scripture. You wake, you doze. You wake again, and always the darkness presses in, not cruelly but thoroughly. Near dawn, as your eyes flutter closed for what feels like the first real time all night, the bell tolls. Of course it does. Matin. Again. You sit up, limbs aching, spirit somewhere between numb and resigned. You reach for your robe, swing your legs over the edge, and plant your feet on the stone floor. Cold. Again. Always. You rise. You shuffle. You return. Because this is monastic life. Not an adventure, not a calling carved in gold, but a quiet choice made again and again. To rise. To serve. To repeat. Matins begins as always with shadows clinging to corners and candlelight flickering like it's half asleep itself. You kneel, you chant, you watch your breath fog in the air as psalm after psalm spills from your lips like water from a cracked jug. This hour doesn't ask for brilliance. It just asks that you show up. And you do. Your knees ache. Your voice wavers. You forget a verse and mumble through it until Brother Julian picks up the line again beside you. No one scolds you. Everyone's forgotten something at 3 a.m. After prayers, you return to the refectory not for porridge this time, but for bread, stale, dense, possibly baked during the Crusades. You chew slowly because chewing quickly risks dislocating a molar. It tastes like obligation. You catch Brother Gilbert's eye across the table. He's smirking. You suspect he's hidden something in your robe pocket again. Last time it was a goose feather. You'll find out later. Probably while kneeling. Today is feast day prep. No, not a literal feast. It's the feast of Saint Walburga, which means an extra psalm and the chance to scrub all the chapel floors until the stone shines like an overachiever's halo. You get assigned to candle prep, scraping, trimming, re-wicking. It's oddly satisfying slicing beeswax like cheese and twisting wicks between your palms. Here's your historical fact. Candle making was a routine part of monastic upkeep. Beeswax was prized not just for its burn quality, but for its symbolic purity. Some monasteries kept entire apiaries with monks tasked solely with the care of bees, silent partners in the production of light. As you work, Brother Ambrose tells you quite solemnly that Saint Walburga once banished a storm by praying at a well. You nod. You do not mention that her feast day has so far brought only drizzle and 6 stubbed toes. You finish the candles just as the prior arrives, his sleeves dusted with flour from overseeing the sacred task of feast day baking, which sounds divine until you realize it's still turnip-based. You help prepare the chapel, dusting altar cloths, polishing candlesticks, arranging flowers. 2 violets and a weed. Someone insisted was symbolically relevant. When the service begins, the bells ring longer than usual. Louder, clearer. The chanting soars for a moment, and it does feel different. For a flicker of time, you understand why monks choose this life, why they rise in the cold, why they endure silence and blisters and Brother Marcus's foot wraps. Because in this hour, with the incense thick and the candles tall and the psalm echoing like a river through the nave, it all feels like it matters. Like your days of routine and repetition have carved out something deeper than habit, something like devotion, or at least surrender. You kneel as you always do. You rise as you always must. And then the final bell tolls, not for the end of the day, but the end of the feast. And with that, the wheel turns once more. The abbey quiets again, the bustle of feast day fading into hush. Candles burn low, shadows grow long, and the walls seem to exhale after holding their breath all day. You lie in your cot, the wool blanket scratchy but warm, the straw mattress pressing its usual constellations into your spine. A breeze slips in through the cracks in the stone, cool, gentle, scented with rosemary from the garden and smoke from the final snuffed wick. You breathe in slowly, deeply. You let your arms go slack, your feet rest heavy. The psalms you've chanted all day hum softly in your mind, the verses braided with the rhythm of your breath. Outside, the wind stirs the ivy on the abbey wall. An owl calls. A sheep bleats once, then falls silent. The world settles. You think about the snails in the mortar, the lavender in your sleeve, the feather in your robe pocket you still haven't found. The routine is heavy but steady. You shift beneath your blanket, eyes half closed, listening to the muffled shuffling of monks bedding down around you. Familiar, comforting, like waves, like prayer, like sleep calling softly from just beyond the edge of thought. The abbey is quiet now. You are still, and the night is long but kind. End of script. Sweet dreams.